Hello, everyone. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art's virtual Humber Lecture, Foundations of the NCMA 1924 to 1960. My name is Maria Lopez, and I'm the manager of film and lecture programs. Thank you so much for joining us for this very special lecture. This virtual lecture is supported by the Robert Lee Humber Lecture Endowment. Robert Lee Humber's devotion to the arts, so eloquently and passionately voiced, brought into being the North Carolina Museum of Art. Dr. Humber continued to support the museum through his leadership and acquiring of many important gifts of art until his death in 1970. With pleasure and gratitude, the museum honors Dr. Humber's efforts by establishing annual lectures that provide an opportunity for the public to be inspired by the collection that Dr. Humber made possible. Our lecturer will present, and then we will have a short Q&A session where we will share your questions. You can enter your questions using the Q&A function or the chat box throughout the lecture, or we're trying something new with these lectures and are trying to make them a little bit more interactive. So if you'd like to share your question out loud with our lecturer, you can use the raise hand function, and we will allow you to unmute yourself to ask your question or make your comment. We would also like to let everyone know that the lecture is going to be recorded and made available on the NCMA YouTube page. And we will share the link to the recording with you via email. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the NCMA's Associate Curator of European Art and Collections History, Lyle Humphrey. Welcome, Lyle.
Hi, thank you. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight. Thank you, Maria. I am going to share this presentation, and if all is good, I will be ready to begin. Before I start though, I want to acknowledge the Robert Lee Humber and the reason for my being here. And this is probably going to be the first Humber lecture in a while in which Mr. Humber himself figures prominently. So I look forward to being able to show you his photographs, and you will see the face behind the name under whose aegis we're having this lecture series, of which I am a part. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the other individuals inside and outside of the museum who have helped me, supported my research on the history of the North Carolina Museum of Art, and also especially Valerie Hillings, who has, from the very beginning, when she started in November 2018, she said, I'm very interested in institutional histories, and I would like to be able to have exhibitions that will celebrate the history of this institution. And I was happy to hear that because I'd already been working on an article on the history of the foundation of the formation of the Italian collection. And then that was the first step. And then we have put together two in a series of exhibitions on the museum's history. And this research is the culmination of that project. So I am going to be showing you maps of downtown Raleigh, aerial views, because first I'm very fascinated in urban history, and I have enjoyed working on the NCMA's history so much because the history really dovetails and runs parallel to, in many ways, the urban development of Raleigh. Also, we have a wonderful photo archival collection in the State Archives of North Carolina, and that is where almost all of these photographs come from. So I thank also Ian Dunn and Van Evans for the incredible assistance finding the negatives and providing the photos to me in the middle of really the height of the pandemic in June, this past June. But the reason why I also will be showing the images of the downtown Raleigh and aerial views is because the history of the NCMA, for the first several decades, it involved an orbit around Capitol Square. So you will see as we proceed how this played out. This is the primary area that I'm going to be, or rather this is shows in red highlight the various or radius, square radius of the museum project from 1924 to 1960. And you may have noticed, if you have had a chance to stroll down East Morgan Street, which is the street on the left running parallel or perpendicular to Wilmington and east of the Capitol. And the street that is shown on the right is Morgan Street from the corner of Wilmington. You may have come across a building that says Museum of Art on the front over the Doric facade over the porch of the front door and wondered what this was or is. Of course, I hope there will be those of you in the audience who remember this museum. Our museum, the first incarnation of the North Carolina Museum of Art proper, was in this building at 107 East Morgan Street, which you can see in the aerial view highlighted and on the right. And some close-ups showing you the name that is engraved in stone on this interesting Doric facade, which dates back to the 1920s. I was surprised to learn recently. So I'm going to tell you how they got here. But first, if you are curious, like me, you might have peeked inside the doors of this Museum of Art, this imposing looking structure. And you would be hard pressed to make a connection between that building and the art museum that we inhabit today on Blue Ridge. It is just an ordinary office. You can tell that the building, the interior has been retrofitted, renovated, all kinds of furniture inserted and reconfigured to make it into usable office space. The only traces from the 1950s are these marble sheathed pillars. So how did the museum get into that space? What did it look like when it got there? And what did it become? Well, the North Carolina Museum of Art's roots actually go back to 1924. And again, we find ourselves back at Capitol Square. And I have two views showing you the square at different dates in the 19 teens and 20s. And we're going to come back to those. But I'm going to just remind viewers and readers tonight that I think the only way you can't really have a discussion about art museums in the South without talking about H.L. Mencken, the humorous, witty journalist who from Baltimore, who wrote a number of biting satirical columns in the teens, including and 20s, including his famous column, The Sahara of the Beaux-Arts, in which he dismisses all cultural achievement below the Potomac. This was published in the New York Evening Mail in November 1917. So this really got into the heads of Southerners for a long time, including residents of Raleigh. And, he basically was looking at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which was founded in 1870. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, also founded that year. Some of the great cultural institutions of the Northeast that were founded in the 19th century. And looking around, and there were not many significant art museums at that point in the South. There was, although there were a few that were in progress, but the National Gallery was founded in 1941 with a gift from the Mellon Foundation that was supplemented by gifts from Samuel H. Crest and Widener. But it turns out that already in North Carolina in 1915, there was an idea afloat to found a state art commission that would, whose purpose was to generate an interest in the arts and an appreciation for art, and to make the public spaces and buildings more beautiful. So this idea was floated in the Greensboro News and Record, and but nothing really came of this until 1924, when the executive secretary of the North Carolina Historical Commission, Robert Burton House, who later became chancellor of the UNC Chapel Hill system. He was then an archivist on the staff of the North Carolina Historical Commission and managing editor of the North Carolina Historical Review, and that was founded in 1924. So he and a group of public-spirited individuals who were members of the Historical and Literary Association decided they would get together one Saturday in December and found an art society. It would be a state art society whose primary mission was to found an art museum. You can see there, they wrote a mission statement with some goals. And the most important goal that they pursued really for decades, it was to aid in securing for the state a museum of art, the building to be of fireproof construction, in which are provided suitable galleries for the display of paintings, sculpture, and other objects of art. They had other missions as well, which was to introduce art into the schools and to beautify the new public highways and school campuses, and to establish a program of art lectures for residents of the state that they would hope would cultivate an interest in art. The cast of characters were they were a dedicated group. Among the 12 founders, the most outspoken and dedicated were John J. Blair, who was the first president for 2 years. He's seen on the left. He was the director of schoolhouse planning for the state. And then a woman in the center, Catherine Pendleton Arrington, known as Kate, who had had many years of volunteer experience. She was a widow, By 1916, she volunteered in the First World War for the Red Cross. She was an indefatigable, fearless, independent woman. She lived in Warrenton, North Carolina, and her house you can see there in the center, which I photographed last summer in beautiful Warrenton, North Carolina, which was a very wealthy, very, very wealthy town that we don't talk about much now, but there was a great deal of landed people living there with farms and means. So Catherine Pendleton Arrington really got around. And by that, I mean, she was peripatetic. She would travel to New York frequently. And you see her in these photographs in the guise of president of the North Carolina State Art Society, which she led from 1926 to 1955. She was the immediate predecessor to Robert L Humber, by the way. And if you've ever talked to me, you know that I am fascinated by this woman, as others have been. And I think that we have not acknowledged her role as we should until recently. And so it's a pleasure to get to know a person who led the charge to founding the great museum that we have today in Raleigh. The other outspoken and dedicated leader was Clarence Poe. You might know he was the editor, publisher, author, editor of the Progressive Farmer magazine, which had been founded in the 19th century. And he famously, I think he became editor in 1915 or earlier. But he grew up in the East in a very small town. He's educated by his mother, who taught in a one-room schoolhouse. He moved to Raleigh and built this house, Longview, which is out in the neighborhood now known as Longview, near Wake Med Hospital, a beautiful house that is actually located on the highest point in Raleigh. And apparently you can see a great view of the city from the house. And also he rode his horse to work every day downtown. Now, Clarence Poe and Catherine Pendleton Arrington, and to a lesser extent, Blair, were involved throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s and 50s. So they really stayed with this project to the very end of their lives. And Poe's gifts to the North Carolina Museum of Art, he collected a couple of paintings in the course of his work for the North Carolina State Art Society, including our beloved painting by N.C. Wyeth, Corn Harvest, and painted in the Brandywine region of Pennsylvania. And then the painting on the left, which is less well known, by the woman painter Lillian Westcott Hale. Now, he brought the painting on the left at one of the exhibitions that the North Carolina Art Society hosted and held every December, beginning in 1927. So where did they do this if they didn't have a building? They were, of course, everything was based downtown around Capitol Square at the time. That was a major business district of Raleigh. And the Sir Walter Hotel, which had just been built in around 1923, was the place where the State Art Society held meetings beginning in December 1924. The building became known as the third house of state government because so many legislators had behind the scenes meetings in the lobby of the Sir Walter. And this building is still standing on Fayetteville Street. And then in that building, the Virginia Dare Ballroom was where they had many of the meetings, lunches, lectures, and exhibitions. And there you see on the left a meeting that took place in 1952, a historic meeting actually that I will mention in a little bit. They didn't have an art collection, of course, and none of the members of the group was collecting art when the group was founded, but they arranged a partnership with the Grand Central Art Galleries in New York, which provided them with paintings and sculptures by living artists, American, who, and these were works that were for sale. This is something they did for other fledgling museums, such as the High Museum in Atlanta that was founded in the early 20th century, and also I think the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. But they sent down about 50 paintings and sculptures for exhibitions once a year until the Depression. It was a huge event, and there are numerous newspaper accounts after every exhibition, days before and days after. As you can see on the right, it was big news. We don't unfortunately have any photographs of exhibitions that were held in the Sir Walter Hotel, but we do have a photograph in the 1920s and 30s, but we do have one that I think was taken in the 40s, possibly in the 50s. I think that that's a painting by Thomas Hart Benton on the right, but I could be wrong. And if John Coffey is in the audience, then I hope he will send a correction in and a date. But they had these great selling exhibitions with illustrated catalogs, many of which were illustrated on the cover with works by women, I should note, and they were very popular. And then in 1927, actually, only a few years after they were founded, out of the blue, the founders of the Art Society received a letter from Robert Pfeiffer, Robert Fullenwider Pfeiffer, who was a resident or a native of Cabarrus County near Charlotte in the town of Concord, which was then in Cabarrus County. Then he wrote a letter from New York where he was living. He had been living in New York for decades, and he was an art collector. He was also a very wealthy landowner in North Carolina, had a large income that he was able to live on without working for much of his adult life. So he became an amateur painter. He traveled to Japan with a group of artists, and then began collecting art in New York, lived in the Calumet Club, and was fascinated to learn from an art magazine that the North Carolina State Art Society had come together and decided to found an art museum in Raleigh. He had been wanting to leave his collection to his native state, and he had written to the city of Charlotte. The Mint had not been founded at this point, and he really couldn't get them to be very interested. And so he wrote to the founders in Raleigh, and he said, I have about 175 actually paintings, watercolors, prints, and I'd like to give them to you if you can find a home for them. So they ended up going, picking up their phones, and they hit speed dial and called the state buildings commissioner and tried to secure some space in one of the government buildings. And then the next year, Pfeiffer dies, and he does end up making the Art Society the beneficiary of his collection. And he also, this is what his collection looked like, by the way. You can see a lot of landscapes that are very pretty, and very not very many figure paintings. They're all about 20 by 30 inches. And you can find these buildings they're actually hanging in various buildings downtown today at the different government agencies. The founders of the Art Society were thrilled, completely, really astonished to learn that when Pfeiffer died, they learned that he had also made them the beneficiary of his trust. And when he died, his estate was worth about $1 million. Now, they were the remainder beneficiary. So the primary beneficiaries, there were 4, and the North Carolina Museum of Art received dividends, and then would receive the portion itself from after one of the heirs died. As time passed, all of the heirs died, and the North Carolina State Art Society came into all of the Pfeiffer Trust in 1968. But in 1929, they didn't know how much this would be worth monetarily, but they ended up really lucking out. And by the way, the Pfeiffer Fund today is the largest endowment fund for acquisitions at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Also, lucky for them, Catherine Pendleton Arrington, during her travels to New York, met a man named John Gellatley, who was a major collector of American art. And he was talking to the Smithsonian Museum, I should say, the museum that was being planned as the Smithsonian. And he was interested in giving away his collection of American paintings. And he met Catherine Pendleton Arrington and said, okay, I'll give you 6 paintings because I am so excited about your mission to found a museum for the state of North Carolina. And he gave these 6 paintings in 1928. Unfortunately, I learned through archival research that we no longer have 2 of them. Those were lent to one of the high schools in Raleigh, as the Art Society was in the practice of lending art in the 1940s, and they went missing at Hugh Morrison High School. And I have images on the right to show you these paintings that they might have resembled, but the ones below here in these great, very important frames designed by Stanford White, all but this one, are hanging in West Building today, 3 of the 4. And then she also met a collector named George DuPont Pratt, the son of Charles Pratt, a partner at Standard Oil. And he donated to Catherine Pendleton Arrington 67 pieces of late antique, early Byzantine and Islamic glass or Islamic glass from the Eastern Mediterranean for the future State Art Museum in North Carolina. I show you on the right his estate in Long Island. It very famous in a estate in Glen Cove that he built around the time that he met Catherine Pendleton Arrington. And we don't know when. There is no record of that meeting, and but it came in. They must have met in the late 20s, and because he died in 1935. The estate in Glen Cove is called Killenworth, and it is now owned by the Russian government. Then this is a Gilded Age mansion. All of the Pratt mansions, by the way, are mostly owned by institutions because it's so few can afford massive Gilded Age estates today. So that's the collection of glass that he gave. By the way, that was a common, it was very common for gifts of ancient glass to be given to newly founded museums in the 1920s and 1930s, as I learned from a colleague from graduate school. And then the next step was, we have this art, we don't have a building. We would like to be given some kind of real estate in or around Capitol Square. They go back and make a case publicly for some real estate, and they end up, this is to show you 1917 to 1923, the Capitol Square, because they ended up with a building, the agriculture building, that was built between 1921 and 23. So again, a new building. They'd been anticipating its completion, and fortunately they were given a room in this building, actually the room that was designed as a boardroom by the government officials. And by the way, this, I like this because it shows you the building that preceded, and it's a famous, really amazing old building that was a hotel that had several names through the years, but the agriculture building went up and replaced that. This building is still standing. This is Edenton Street. Okay, so they end up with this building, and or rather with a room in this building, and that's where they display the Pfeiffer collection, which opens in 1929 in a gallery they have called the Temporary State Art Museum. And again, making their case publicly for something permanent. Hint, hint, this is only temporary. And then in, 1929, major event on Wall Street, and the country goes into a depression thanks to the crash of 29 and consequences of that. So they had exhibitions. They still continue to have exhibitions because Catherine Pendleton Arrington donated. Basically, she bankrolled the organization throughout the 1930s, but she turned her attention to supporting North Carolina artists, including North Carolina artists who were living in New York, and organized a number of exhibitions, and including art by Mabel Pugh, who was the head of the art department at Peace College, but lived in New York in the 1920s and made these wonderful woodcuts. But they needed something else to get them, to keep them going. And in 1935, the FDR administration founded the Federal Art Project of the Works Progress Administration. And they founded this Federal Art Project, which was going to establish art centers all around the country. And they picked Raleigh to be the first federal art center in the country in 1935. It opened in November of that year on Fayetteville Street, 413. So that's why I show this path. And this is where the building was. It is no longer standing. It is I can't remember what the building is. It's there now, but it's very modern, and there's also a garage. But the Federal Art Project and the Art Center became a thriving, a really center of cultural life in North Carolina. And on Fayetteville Street, they would, in partnership with the Federal Art Project in Washington, hosted exhibitions of art that was sent from Washington by artists who were working for the WPA, and artists, and other art, including old masters. But they also hosted and held classes for students and adults. And it remained on Fayetteville Street for 2 years, and then it moved to Broughton High School. But first, in 1939, the Art Society gets a larger semi-permanent space. The agriculture building, they only had one room there. They needed more space. So they managed to get 2 rooms in the former Hall of History that was located in the administration building, also known as the old Supreme Court building, also known as the library building, which is still standing, and it's a beautiful building at 1 East Morgan Street. They moved there in 1939, but meanwhile, the WPA Art Project moves to Broughton High School. And they continue operations, having classes, and this is what kind of continues to breathe life into the Art Society. And in 1939, they form a partnership with the Art Society founders, and they end up having exhibitions. Basically, all of the WPA Federal Art Project programs were run by the Art Society founders through and based in the Supreme Court building gallery space. This is a satellite WPA extension center, art center, and at Crosby Garfield School that was founded in 1939, and an incredibly important program that provided free art instruction. And we have some wonderful paintings that were made by students at Crosby Garfield in the 1938 and 39. That school was folded into Ligon, but the building is still there and used as a Wake County Outreach Center. Exhibitions throughout the 1940s in that state art gallery in the old Supreme Court building. But they get to a turning point when the federal government decides to terminate the Federal Art Project when recovery was somewhat underway in 1941. And so they have run out of sources of external support, and they decide the Second World War has ended. It is time to go back to the legislature and ask for some real investment. So they have an energetic new member has joined their ranks, Robert L. Humber from Greenville, North Carolina. He was an attorney, and he was basically a very skillful lobbyist. And he ended up convincing Representative John Carr of Warrenton. He and John Carr decide they're going to draft a bill. He, of course, was just assisting as a private citizen, but they draft a bill that would provide $1 million to the State Art Society of Treasury surplus that had been built up in the Second World War. Many groups were vying for this surplus, and miraculously, the Humber and Carr convinced the legislature to pass the bill. It became known immediately as the $1 Million Art Bill. It passed by a margin of 7 votes, and in the very last hour of the last session of 1947. The gift specified that the founders had to line up a matching gift. I mean, or rather, the appropriation was contingent upon receipt of a matching gift from a private source. So Humber had a person in mind, but nothing lined up formally, and it took several years. But in 1951, they found a donor. Just to give you a sense of $1 million, in 1947, the equivalent today is $11.9 million. So a significant sum of money. And but the search for a donor continued for several years, and it wasn't until 1951 that Humber and the society leaders were able to persuade someone to give them $1 million. It turned out to be Samuel H. Crest and the Samuel H. Crest Foundation. The Crest Foundation was founded by Samuel H. Crest and his brothers as a means for distributing and making available to the public some or all of the vast art collection that Samuel H. Crest had built up and formed in the beginning in 1929 until he became incapacitated after a stroke in 1947. So as also the law mandated that they get a art commission together. The governor was to appoint a 5-member state art commission drawn from the membership of the State Art Society that would be in charge of spending the $1 million state appropriation. They still don't have money in hand, by the way, but they have formed a commission. And the commission consists of the 5 members of the State Art Society, including Kate Arrington, Clarence Poe, Robert L Humber, and Edwin Gill, who was the state treasurer, and became a very devoted member of the Art Society and leader. And only one art historian, Clement Summer, a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. He was one of many immigrants from Germany who had come over during the Hitler persecutions. So because they only had one art historian among them, they engaged an art dealer in New York, a shrewd, wily man named Carl W. Hamilton, who was actually a collector of Italian Renaissance art, made money selling palm oil, and had a second career as an art dealer. He knew his way around the New York gallery circuit, and so he advised the commission. And in the fall of 1951, they selected 174 paintings in the New York art trade. And they were told by the state auditor and at the time that dominant emphasis should be placed on the acquisition of old masters. So they were very clear. The legislature and the surrounding supportive cast in the government that they were not to collect modern art. So they selected works, put them on hold, and they had one last step before they could actually get the state auditor to release the money. And that was to have the collection vetted by a distinguished art professional. In the law that was written, it was to be the chief curator or director of the National Gallery of Art. But you see on the right, the building that was the National Gallery just upon completion in 1941. A beautiful lantern slide from the Library of Congress. But the National Gallery refused. John Walker, who was the head of the director of the National Gallery, said, "No way am I going to get involved in that. I am not going to touch that." And so Robert L. Humber and Carl Hamilton got together, and Carl said, "I know just the person. He is the most esteemed art professional in America. He's been director of 4 museums and curator of 1, and been working in museums since 1914, a German born and trained art historian, Wilhelm Valentiner. Most recently, he had been director of the Los Angeles County Art Museum and had been advising J. Paul Getty in the establishment of the Getty Museum. Carl Hamilton shows up on his doorstep on December 26, 1951, hauling 2 suitcases full of ectochromes, and says, "Can you please look at all this and tell us what you think, yes or no?" So he was just taken aback, but a very, very generous man and scholar, and he agreed to do the job, and he ended up approving about 90% of the works they had picked out. There was a lawsuit that I will skip because more important was that the money was released in early 1952. They put all these paintings and 2 sculptures and 25 pieces of furniture in storage in New York because they didn't have a building. But right after, around the same time, they learned that from the Pfeiffer Trust that they are going to receive a distribution of $300,000 after one of his principal heirs died. So they end up having $1.3 million to spend. So they purchased an additional 31 paintings for a total of 201 paintings, plus the 25 pieces of furniture and 2 sculptures. It ends up being a really interesting collection and full of highlights, really outstanding works. And the only modern work they purchased was by Maurice Stern. This was the only work that was 20th century. But they did a good job of assembling a collection of old masters, which were not cheap. You can see how they spent the funds here. And it's interesting because you'll see that they spent over half of their funds on Dutch and Flemish art. Dutch, Flemish, and German. Now, the most expensive work was a German painting by Stefan Lochner, and this was $64,000 some dollars, whereas the average price paid for a work of art then in their lot that they received was it's $12,000. So that was an expensive painting and very important, and I encourage you to look at it in the West Building sometime. But the other high price tags. So why was over half the money spent on Dutch and Flemish? Now, I know my colleague Michelle Frederick would say it's because Dutch and Flemish art is better than Italian or other art, but that's not actually true. Because they ended up buying things that were the Flemish paintings were exorbitant, and it was because they wanted names, and they wanted the name Peter Paul Rubens. So they purchased 7 paintings attributed to Rubens, and that's where a lot of their money went. And here are some of the highlights from that purchase in 1952, that historic purchase that is now our core collection. And this shows the other high price tags, and including the wonderful leave-ins, which is one of the best. I would say the top two works of that purchase were the Jan Steen and the leave-ins. And meanwhile, back at the State Art Gallery, so it's still going, and yes, it moves again. It moves this time to the newly constructed wing of the education building that had been built in 1938. By the way, parenthetically, the way that I was able to date this photograph is because the education building that you see here, this shape here, was begun in 1937, and here it is completed in 1938. But they moved into a wing that was built over here in 1951, and the State Art Gallery remained there until mid-January 1955. 1952, the State Art Gallery adopts a new name, the North Carolina Museum of Art. This is that historic meeting in the Virginia Dare Ballroom. This is downtown Raleigh in the 1950s to set the scene. They don't have a building that is their own yet. They don't have a permanent building. They end up securing one in 1953, though. So the old State Highway Commission building was available because this building here was built in 1950. This is the Department of Transportation headquarters still today. It became the new headquarters of the predecessor agency, the State Highway Commission. And here is the State Highway Commission old quarters right there, which was originally a 2-story building built between 1917 and 1923, and enlarged between 1923 and 25. So this is what the building kind of looked like when they received it in 1953. It was an ordinary office building, and they did not see it as permanent. They were happy, though, to have a building that was fireproof. And they began demolition so that they could transform this kind of worn down building into an art museum. That took place between 1954 and 1956. They don't have a director, but in the summer of 1955, Carl Hamilton, the art dealer, and Robert L. Humber, the chief proponent and leader of the Art Society and the Art Museum mission, decide to call Wilhelm Valentiner, the man who had vetted the collection they had purchased in 1952, and see if they could persuade him to become their first director. He had just retired. This was his, I think, second or third attempt at retirement. And he was living in Italy. He had only been there for a few months and was perfectly happy. But he loved a project that he could oversee from the ground up. He just saw this enormous potential, and he ended up accepting this job. Moves to Raleigh in October 1955 and starts on November 1st. Robert L. Humber, by the way, was elected president of the Art Society in 1955. Around this time, I think it might even have been the same month, because Catherine Pendleton Arrington died. So she led it all the way through until her deathbed, and then passed the baton to Humber. 1955, late December, Merry Christmas and happy holidays, because the collection is about to be delivered. It comes in 2 different shipments from New York. And you can see the government officers and leaders of the Art Society, the governor, all wearing suits while others do the hard work, bringing the paintings in. And the Jan Steen on the right, it was a very exciting moment. And they did end up with a really fantastic collection. They install it between January and March 1956. This was taken in February 1956. This is a famous German scholar and museum curator. And you can see the leave-ins right here and here. And here are images of the collection after it had been installed just before the opening, which was going to be on April 6, 1956. It was a day of jubilation. Governor Hodges cuts the ribbons and people pour in, apparently very, very well attended, and thousands came the first weekend to see the museum. It was billed as a miracle on Morgan Street by the journalist Nell Battle Harris, who wrote a column called Incidentally in the NNO during that period. And it was indeed, it did seem like a miracle. And the effort and opening received lots of national press. And we have some great photographs from the opening summer. Editors and editorial page editors were quick to point out that they had proved H.L. Mencken wrong. This was a common theme on editorial pages throughout North Carolina throughout 1956. And we're coming to the last 3 years. So we have a really experienced, very well-connected, internationally known director, and we have energetic North Carolinians who are running and providing support. And they end up bringing in a number of contributions of art and donations in the first 3 years, and really received some outstanding, surprising works of art as gifts. Hercules, because you see here, he's in the atrium. He actually got kicked upstairs the day after the museum opened because people were offended by his exposed genitals. He was replaced with the plaster cast of Canova's sculpture of George Washington, the famous sculpture that burned in the original State House. The Olsen Gift is something that came in 1957. A couple from Connecticut. This is just one of many individuals in the United States who ended up giving the part or making gifts from their art collections, or just funding purchases for this exciting museum in Raleigh. The Olsens gave a group of ancient Coptic and a couple of Mesoamerican and Greek, Roman, Egyptian, interesting collection, and a painting by Robert Motherwell. But I like to point out that they were the first owners of Jackson Pollock's painting Blue Poles. So major collectors and philanthropists. And this enabled the museum to open new galleries. The Docents Program gets going in 1956. they began training docents for exhibitions that included the Rembrandt exhibition in fall of 1956, which Valentina organized. Also, I'm going to just show you quickly some of these donations that you may recognize that came in during those first 3 years. But gifts of modern art that were made by Valentina, or I should say contemporary art, because he lamented the fact that the founders had not been able to acquire 20th century art. And so he gave the Devencorn painting and Motherwell, and then some other paintings, and this encouraged others to give as well. Another exhibition that was significant was Valentina organized a retrospective of the German expressionist Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. So it was major news, international news. Also, the North Carolina Art Bulletin is founded. They hire a curator of education in 1958, Charles Stanford, who ends up becoming director later. And you can see the very important role that the docents played in the galleries as they do today, taking through school groups and adults. It is now 8 o'clock, so I'm going to skip over this because we're going to return to this in another few months at the museum in an exhibition, so that I can tell you about the Crest Gift, which is the very last event in this event-filled period that ends in at the end of 1960. The gift that they had been trying to line up that was to be a matching gift ended up being a promise from the Crest Foundation to donate a collection of art worth $1 million. It was going to be mostly Italian Renaissance and paintings, and they promised it would be worth at least $1 million, but that the organizers needed to get a building. And back in 1951, they said, we're not going to give you anything until you get a building and you are well established, because we don't want to send an incredibly valuable collection. And they actually said, and have it be installed in a barn. Very, very regionalist slur. But they don't, in fact, send anything until the building, the NCMA had opened in 1956, and the founders are tapping their fingers, waiting and waiting for something to come, for some word from the Crest Foundation to come. Some of the many, some treasures from Samuel H. Crest's residence that were well known, that were being distributed all over the country to regional museums. And the Crest Foundation made good on their promise. In 1960, they ended up presenting 69 paintings and 2 sculptures, and it ended up being the largest and arguably most important Crest regional collection that was valued at the time at over $2.5 million. It contained a number of important works, including one of the most important collections of 14th century Italian paintings still today in this country. They celebrate this great gift with another party. And I am going to close by showing you the paintings and sculptures in this wonderful Crest Gift. And I will mention that among the important works that were given was this complete Jotto Altarpiece, the only Jotto Altarpiece housed outside of Europe. And it is something that we have traced. We believe it was created for a chapel in the great Franciscan Church of Santa Croce in Florence in around 1309. And but not only did the Crest Foundation send Italian paintings and 2 sculptures, but 10 great European, Northern European paintings, including this, one of the highlights of that gift, the Terbrühen. And it is also, along with this French triptych, a real a treasure in the collection today. I'm going to leave you there, and I'm going to ask for questions, but I'm going to just say before that where I'm leaving you is I'm leaving this at the point where Valentiner died in 1958. There was a period when there was Valentiner's deputy who stepped in as director, but they didn't have a director that they believed they would keep until 1961. They appointed Eustace Beer, and he became the second director. So I'm showing you his image. He's another German German immigrant who had been living in the United States for a long time, and a scholar of medieval art. So that is where the next chapter of this story will pick up, and eventually, and also to show you this image of downtown Raleigh in the 1960s. So the big event being the building of the House of Legislature that is there now, designed by the same architect as the building on the Blue Ridge campus. So that's where this was a pivotal event, and ultimately the museum would move out to Blue Ridge in the early 1980s. But I invite any questions about this, any corrections, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Lyle, for that very fascinating lecture. I do have one question asking if George Pratt ever visited North Carolina.
I do not know yet. And trust me, I have tried to find out. I've done numerous searches in the North Carolina newspaper indices, and I have not come up with a visit, any kind of documentation of that. But I do feel like there must have been a connection between Pratt and North Carolina that led to his encounter with Catherine Pendleton Arrington. Good question.
And there's a couple of comments in the chat. Superb Lyle from Barry Grossman, thanks so much. Sue Scott says, so many great stories, thank you. And Charles says, thank you so much, I love this. Yes, I remember Bacchus in the first building. And Patrick just said, your presentation is outstanding.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's great seeing those images of downtown Raleigh, isn't it? It's there's so much to learn from any one photograph, and it's been fun tracing the history through those.
Okay, well, if no one has any questions, we don't want to keep you too long and want you to enjoy your Thursday night. Lyle, is there anything else you want to add in closing?
No, but if anyone has any questions, and feel free to email me, and we can continue a dialogue.
Oh,
one way.
we did just get one question from Liz Moore.
Okay.
She said it's a very interesting talk. Thank you. She loves the museum. Her favorite collection is Dutch and Flemish, but she's also a huge fan of Andrew and NC Wyeth. Any plans for acquiring more of those?
Oh, NC Wyeth and Andrew Wyeth. You'll have to ask our new curator of American art, Lauren Applebaum, whom you will meet soon. She just started on May 1st.
And yes, Lynn, she's asking if the presentation will be recorded and available later. Yes, it's recorded, and I will upload it onto our YouTube page and share the link with everyone.
Okay, great. Oh, I do have one other thing to say, which is
Mhm.
that there is going to be another, a third exhibition dedicated to North Carolina Museum of Art History that will open in the summer of 2022. And it is going to be a retrospective look at the collecting of the North Carolina Museum of Art from through the decades from 1924 to the present. And so it's going to look at 10 decades of collecting, and it's going to be more of an art rather than archival based exhibition. And I'm really excited about it. And I will say the NC Wyeth painting on the Brandywine corn harvest is going to be in that exhibition. It was actually out on loan to the Brandywine Museum for a long time during my first history exhibition. So I'm really excited that that's going to be able to be seen.
And I just want to share one comment that we just got from William Rasdorf. This presentation was a very valuable contribution that in itself should become a historical component of the NCMA. I agree, William.
Thank you so much.
This was so insightful. And yeah, I'm ready for part 3.
Well, I wish I could invite everyone over for dinner because this is really good for my ego. Thank you. I'm loving this. It's, as you can tell, I really love the history, and it's a great story.
I actually do have a question, Lyle. A lot of the images, the historical images that you used in your presentation are so clear and pristine.
Yes.
How did you acquire them and get them to look so great?
Oh, thank you. Well, I found, I was able to find the negatives. I myself did not find the negatives, but I went through newspapers, and when I saw a photograph that was published, you can actually go to the archives downtown. They have all of the N&O negative collection, and you can give them a date, and they can look to see if they have a negative for that date. This is only after, it's not until the 1930s, maybe not even until the 40s. So for the early period, there isn't very much, but I'm glad you asked too, because it's really thanks to the hard work and generosity of the audio visual archivists that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, who work in the State Archives of North Carolina, which is a sister agency to the Museum of Art, all part of the Department of Cultural and Natural Resources. And but they made fantastic high resolution scans. And then the other thing was that I also went to the Library of Congress archives. I went to the Crest Foundation archives, the National Gallery of Art archives, and that and then in some cases, if I didn't have an image, then I was able to find a few things on Flickr and ask for permission to use. But most of these are things, oh yes, that you can search. The great, wonderful archivists downtown have made all of their negatives that they have scanned available on Flickr. So you can actually go and just look on, just open up the internet and search on their Flickr page. And they have an excellent searching capability and many, many, many albums. And if you like to do that, I warn you, you can be there for hours. But it's amazing. It's an incredible, incredible resource.
Well, thank you so much, Lyle. This was really insightful. And, it seems like the attendees tonight also agree. Love this history lesson. And to everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this lecture and look forward to having you at our upcoming events, which will now be in person as well.
Yes.
So thank you so much. And we also invite you to come visit the museum. We're open. We want you to be there to support. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Thanks
Bye.
all. Good night.